Hello and welcome once again to English Composition 2. I'm your host, Mr. Fowler, and today we're going to be digging into our secondary text, Practical Argument 3rd edition. Specifically, we're going to look at Chapter 5 about logical arguments and how to avoid logical fallacies. A lot of this material you'll probably already be relatively familiar with. So not too many bells and whistles for you today. I'll try to make it as interesting, as engaging as I can, adding some side commentary, but realistically, this is probably just one of those watch and observe videos. Now, next session's video will be a little bit more interesting, or next session's discussion, because we'll be talking about the next paper in the paper project series. So we want to make sure that we have logical evidence of logical fallacies under our grasp before we move into that next project. So that's what today's lesson is going to focus on. I'm going to quickly share a PowerPoint with you as per usual. And then again, you're going to see me sort of drop out here on occasion. So generally, let's go through the details for today. We have a preview and review, as we do for each and every session. So I'm going to take the next couple of minutes here to process that with you. So last time when we met, we talked about The Princess Bride, okay? Chapter number 5. So if you finished that for today, you are in good standing. If you haven't, well, you get a little bit of a respite because Mr. Fowler had some unexpected technical difficulties that cropped up earlier this week. So you may have a reprieve on the reading time for that particular chapter. I don't think it will be difficult reading. It's fairly fascinating, at least I thought so. And I hope you find it to be that way also. But we had talked last time about some of the conventions related to the character of the Man in Black. And specifically, he was an invention of the high romantic genre and had even been discussed by Geoffrey Chaucer. Now, that's the second time Geoffrey Chaucer has come up in our discussions. So if anybody's really interested in sort of medieval literature and you want to do some sort of comparative analysis over the Canterbury Tales, I don't know that that's what I would focus on if I were a student at this level. That may be more like a 200 level literature class. But it's interesting to note that this motif, this trope of the Man in Black, the knight who strives for true love, is a long-held tradition, and particularly part of The Princess Bride. We've also sort of begun to see more and more of the editorial juxtapositions from William Goldman. And that leads into this week's discussion question, which we'll preview in just a few moments, asking you, why do you think he's up to this? Why is he spending so much time discussing his wife, discussing his real life, his relationships with his son, his father, and his wife Helen, as it relates to the telling of the story? Is the teller someone who narrates the story by adding elements of his or her life into the mix? And is there a reason that Goldman would like these comparisons to be more transparent than perhaps they already are? I don't know. That's up for you to discuss and write about this week. We also talked a little bit about Buttercup, and specifically, I argued that given the context of when the book was published in 1973, she's become a bit more expansive in terms of her thought process. She is 21 years old after all, and she has made some efforts to save her life. Now, I think that's relatively bold for a female from this type of period literature transposed into a 1973 worldview. I know it's difficult to imagine this, but in 1973, there had not yet been any movement toward Title IX. So women in sports was a relatively limited phenomenon, mostly in professional sports before that point in time, but certainly no call for equal representation of the genders along sports programs. If you've ever read the book, The Lovely Bones, Susie Salmon, the protagonist of that book, talks about this in light of being sexually assaulted. She said, you have to understand that in this era, it wasn't cool for girls to be, to fight back. It wasn't cool for them to be, physically challenge someone, especially an older man. So those kinds of things, the self-defense movement and the second wave of feminism that kicked off in the late 60s and was just sort of growing by the era of 1973 when this book was published, are all factors that we have to take into account when we're sort of criticizing someone like Buttercup. Now, that may be an issue for debate and a great potential paper topic. Does Buttercup hold up as a heroine in the 21st century? Or is she lacking some of the certain qualifications that we would look for active or informed female characters in today's literature? To use another popular example from the larger culture, you think of Anna from what's it called? Frozen, right? She's a little bit more atypical than, say, her sister Elsa. But does that mean Anna is less of a heroine for her own story than Elsa is? You could apply the same logic to Buttercup. Is Buttercup less of a heroine or less of a character because she's a little bit more traditional, or is that just part of the trope in the literature that she finds herself in? Are there moments where she shines through as more of a competent sort of heroine or individual or just character in general? That would be a really interesting topic to pursue. Okay, so that's a brief rehash of some of the things that we talked about during the last session. I also wanted to point out real briefly that your papers, your final drafts of your ad analysis projects looked great. I thought that you all did a really beautiful job of revising according to my commentary and according to the commentary that you shared through the peer review process. Now, I know a lot of you had some questions and concerns about peer review, and I've admitted this before, and I'll just briefly touch on it again. I'm struggling with ways to make peer review meaningful and successful with this particular situation. Short of just assigning all of you a random peer review paper, I don't know how else to get everybody to react to peer review. So luckily, we really don't have to engage that much more in peer review this semester. But if that is an option that you're interested in, that may be the only recourse left available to me, is to make sure everybody is sent a peer review form and a copy of a student essay. And then you just turn that in. That may be the route that we have to go. But in any event, we're going to move on to our lecture for today. It's a long one, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm also going to get rid of the visual element because I've heard, again, that makes it a little more streamlined, a bit more smooth. And like I said, I've been having some technical issues as of late with Zoom. So I'll try to make that a little bit better for you. You'll hear my dulcet voice, but you won't necessarily see my visage here. So like I said, hopefully you can still hear me at this point. And let's see here. I'm going to start my slideshow from the beginning. And of course, today we're reviewing understanding logic and recognizing logical fallacies from Practical Argument, Chapter 5. Logic, as we know, comes from the Greek word logos, which alternatively could mean word, thought, principle, reason. Reason, I think, is the most applicable definition that we're working with. So why study logic? We study logic to draw conclusions and make valid points. But more importantly, for the purposes of a writing class like this one, we use the study of logic to help us evaluate the arguments of others. That's what I was just talking about in relationship to peer review. I feel it's important because while I might have an emphasis on grammar and mechanics, I think a good peer reviewer can point out potential flaws in the logic of an argument that we assemble. We also, of course, study logic to communicate clearly and more forcefully. And you can see the example of a couple of soccer players here arguing with a referee. Oftentimes, the most logical argument will be the most forceful and win the day. When we discuss logic, we have to think about deductive logic versus inductive logic. These ways of organizing our thoughts and our arguments. And as you can see over here on the left, the deductive argument is one that moves from a general sense of a theory or an idea to more specific information, whereas an inductive argument moves from a general observation to a particular theory. So it moves they move in opposite directions. Thomas Jefferson used deductive reasoning to construct the United States construct the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. Neil deGrasse Tyson used inductive reasoning, a scientific method to draw conclusions from evidence that he observed. So deductive reasoning typically tends to start with a premise, a statement or assumption on which a general argument is based and conclusions can be drawn. Again, the focus here is a move from general to specific information. The funnel effect, as you've probably heard me call it before. Now, typically, deductive reasoning tends to be illustrated with a specific type of example called a syllogism. Now, a syllogism is an example that uses three parts. And this may sound familiar if you've hung with the rational sense of argument and design that we've talked about all semester long. The three parts are the major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. And they're basically elements that you've already used in the education and writing process before. A general statement relates two terms and their similarity or disparities. A minor premise provides an example to solidify the writer or speaker's opinion, and the conclusion follows logically if the two premises are supported or supportive. Now, there's a difference between just constructing a regular syllogism and a sound syllogism. A sound syllogism must meet some specific criteria. Number one, a syllogism must be valid. It must flow logically from its premise. So for example, an initial premise might be something like this. When a government oppresses its people, the people have a right to rebel. It should also be true, meaning that when the premises are consistent, they should be able to be fact-checked and they should hold up under scrutiny. The government of England oppressed the American people. That's something that is both true and can be checked with historical evidence. But lastly, if you can make sure that your syllogism is both valid and true, it should be sound or considered sound, as in this last component. The American people had the right to rebel against England. And you can move back up the chain of information too. Why did they have the right to rebel against England? They oppressed American people. And when a government oppresses its people, they have the right to rebel. This kind of movement up and down the chain of logic should create a sound syllogism, which is a good way to promote deductive reasoning. Now, validity only tests an argument structure, right? It does not test the soundness of an argument. So, for example, is it valid to say that all recipients of support services are wealthy? Okay, well, if that's true, and Dylan is a recipient, it stands to reason that Dylan is wealthy. The structure alone works. But if you dig deeper into the argument structure, you can see that there are some glaring errors here. All recipients of support services are wealthy. Dylan is a recipient, therefore, again, Dylan should be wealthy. But the premise, the minor premise, is false. Some recipients may be wealthy while others are not. I misspoke there a moment ago. That's the major premise. So when the premise is false, obviously the validity of your argument is in question. Typically, this is the result of an illogical middle term or middle premise. Right? A syllogism can be valid without being true. The middle term occurs in both the major and minor premises, but does not occur in a conclusion. Here's a good example of what we're talking about. All dogs are mammals. That's true. That's your major premise. Your minor premise is that some mammals are porpoises. Okay, that's also true. That can be fact-checked and verified. But your final premise, or your final conclusion, rather, some porpoises are dogs, is highly illogical. It doesn't make any sense. So that's what's referred to as an invalid syllogism. Typically, a key term shifts in meaning from your major to your minor premise, right? So again, another example of an invalid syllogism is the term mankind versus man using this example. Only man is capable of analytical reasoning. Anna is not a man. Two fact-checked worthy ideas or premises. But when we get to the conclusion, therefore Anna is not capable of analytical reasoning, we've run into a problem. Because clearly the term man referred to all of mankind in the initial major premise, but the fact that Anna is not a man, denoting her gender, is at issue because the key term shifted. So a more valid or corrected version of this would be that all educated human beings, rather, are capable of analytical reasoning. Anna is an educated human being. Therefore, Anna is capable of analytical reasoning. Now we have a correct syllogism or valid syllogism. That invalid syllogisms can also occur as part of a negative premise. This is sort of the same thing as why you should not use double negatives in writing or in speech, right? I ain't no mathematician. Well, that in and of itself suggests that you in fact are a mathematician, because you are not a mathematician. You're a mathematician of some degree. But that's clearly not wasn't what the intent of the spoken dialogue was. So you can see here the invalid minor premise creates all sorts of problems for us. Only senators can vote on legislation. No students are senators. Therefore, students can vote on legislation. So that creates a problem. You can also have two invalid premises. Disabled students may not be denied special help. Jen is not a disabled student. Therefore, Jen may not be denied special help. So, two negative premises can invalidate a syllogism. There is in this fairly comical example. One negative premise only should be allowed at a time when you're developing a good syllogism. And here's the correction. Disabled students may not be denied special help. Jen is then a disabled student, and she may not be denied special help. Otherwise, the argument would fall apart completely. Enthymemes are syllogisms with one or two parts of its argument, typically the major premise missing. This can also be referred to as bumper sticker thinking, right? And there's a great example in your text of how this premise plays out itself. Often the major premise is left out because we think they're fairly obvious and don't need to be stated or written in the course of an essay. For example, people who lie cannot be trusted. Okay, that seems fairly accurate or fairly logical. But then when you apply the minor premise, Robert has lied, and then that leads to the conclusion, Robert cannot be trusted. Well, wait a minute. What kinds of lies has Robert told? Has he told white lies to save someone's, save someone from a painful, circumstance? Has he lied to, not spoil a birthday party surprise? Or has he lied about whether or not he took money from a bank drawer? We don't really know. So we would have to create an idea that in our major premise clarified the meaning behind our thinking. Lastly, I'm going to give you some fairly dangerous information here, which is yours to use as you see fit. It's true that some writers know readers will often accept end themes, and they'll do so uncritically. This has become a very popular method to stir up belief or rally a base to a particular opinion, because writers will do this intentionally. This is also why it's very important for us to be able to identify end themes when we see them. And again, bumper sticker thinking is a pretty good example of the kinds of problems that can arise from this type of strategy. So if you have your textbook handy and you turn with me to, which page is it? Bumper sticker thinking. Page 131. You can see a whole host of bumper stickers, right? Question authority. Well, should you always question authority? I don't know. Homophobia is a social disease. It may be, but it's a bumper sticker way of thinking. It suggests that there is one specific perspective. No one is free when others are oppressed. Well, I don't know that that's true, because obviously, if you think about that one in particular, if there is an oppressed group and there are oppressors, there's at least some suggestion that the oppressors are free. You know, that's a really tough kind of example to think about, given the version of information presented in our text. But you know, it's not necessarily completely logical. You know, self-control. Here are some others from the same couple of pages. Self-control beats birth control. I could see some potential doubts about that. You should believe in peace. Oh, sorry, just I misread that or read more into it. Peace is patriotic. Maybe it is. You know, no one needs a mink coat except a mink. Okay, maybe, unless you're freezing to death and there are an excess of minks, you might feel differently. Now, some of these, of course, like I said, beg for our attention. And whether or not we think about each of these critically is dependent upon how we decide to use our powers of observation, how we decide to use our ability to think and critically analyze an argument. You could go for an uncritical analysis, and this is a great example right out of your textbook. North Korea is ruled by a dictator, so it should be invaded. There are certain ways to assess this argument and come up with full and complete agreement. But a critical analysis asks you to determine the following. If all countries governed by dictators should be invaded, and North Korea is a country governed by a dictator, therefore North Korea, of course, should be invaded. One point follows logically from the others. The major and the minor premise are in agreement, and they seem to move toward a logical conclusion. But if we look at this critical analysis, we have to ask a series of questions. Okay, should all countries governed by dictators be invaded? Well, you know, Nicaragua was recently ruled by, or came under the rule of, a dictator. But were they worthy of invasion? Some people would cynically say that they're not, because they don't have any valuable resources, nor do they threaten or have the potential to threaten the peace of sovereign nations like the United States. However, if we're talking about North Korea, who does have the means to threaten sovereign states, who may be, and there's very good evidence to suggest that this is true, they may be subjugating their people or oppressing them with violence. Should they be invaded? Or should their sovereignty be appreciated in some way, shape, or form? And if there is going to be an invasion, who should do it? And who should be responsible for the consequences of that invasion? So a more critical analysis asks you to consider the evidence and whether or not it truly does flow together logically. Deductive arguments are very similar to essays like your ad analysis paper. They move from general principles toward a more specific conclusions, or a series of conclusions. Inductive reasoning, of course, works in the opposite way, as we saw earlier. You begin with some very specific observations or evidence, and then you lead to a general conclusion. Children are very typical at using, are very typical good users of inductive reasoning. And the good dog, bad dog analogy is a great version of how to comprehend this. Because if a child has mostly good interactions with dogs, they're going to operate under the premise that all dogs are good, or all dogs are nice. Now, if they don't have all positive interactions, if they encounter a negative dog or an aggressive dog, they will change their reasoning and adapt their view based on the inclusion of new evidence. Now, if that premise sounds familiar, it's because scientists also use inductive reasoning. That is what's referred to as the scientific method. Now, I'm not a science teacher, but I remember enough about the scientific method to suggest that information is gathered after a theory or proposed theory or train of thought is introduced. And then you test that theory based on sensory information that you can elicit from the subject. And then you change your theory or change your premise based on the introduction of new or better evidence. Same example can be found in your book when they talk about the fact that for many years, most of human history, people assumed that the Earth was at the center of the universe and the sun revolved around it. Well, this is, of course, contrary to current day thinking, where we know that the sun, in fact, is at the center of the universe and it is the Earth that revolves around it. Now, in terms of the inferences that you make with inferred thinking, they can be deductive or inductive. But with a deductive way of thinking, we are left with just two options. It's either valid or it's invalid. Inductive thinking is a little bit more flexible. Typically, the ideas about inferences are broken down as either strong or weak. They have a different set of categories here. So any inference or statement about the unknown based on what is known can require you to make an inductive leap, meaning that you connect information in a logical way, but you're willing to admit that you may be wrong or change your perspective when better or new information becomes available. So when it comes to strong inductive arguments versus weak inductive arguments, the authors of our text suggest that your conclusion is only as strong as the evidence that you gather. So what type of evidence should you gather, and what quality should that information exhibit? Well, generally, you want to take large samples of information, because if you're narrowing down your arguments to a specific group or small sample size, you're not going to really be able to have a true grasp on the situation. Sometimes information is insufficient or not representative of the whole. So if you're only reviewing the statistical belief of, say, 4 out of 5 dentists, well, that sounds like it would be a good idea, but again, you may have an insufficient sample size. Imagine that you only tested 10 dentists altogether, and 4 out of the 10 got back to you, or 5 out of the 10 rather got back to you, and of that 5, only 4 agreed. Well, that sounds a lot less impressive than 4 out of 5 dentists recommend, tartar control toothpaste. Evidence should also support your general conclusion. And when you're creating strong evidence, or you're introducing strong evidence into your writing, now this is key for us, you should avoid words like every, all, and always, and replace them typically with better, what they call wiggle words, which could include some words like most, or often, or frequently. So again, good evidence should be not too broad. It should be representative, meaning it's not atypical. It's not a biased representation. So it should be typical, okay? It should support your general conclusion and be left out if it doesn't support that idea. And of course, lastly, use words like most, many, usually, instead of words that commit you too strongly to your argumentative points. Sorry. Okay, so that's the first half of the chapter. Those are the ways that the authors of the book want you to sort of understand the structure of how to present a logical argument. So once you have those two ideas in hand, the deductive method, the inductive method, deductive, again, you move from very specific to very general, and with an inductive sense of argumentation, you move from very specific examples to a general premise, or the support of a general idea or general conclusion. But along the way, there is a potential for all of us as writers, speakers, people of authority, student learners, to slip up and give in to a logical fallacy. Now, a fallacy is an error in reasoning that essentially undermines the logic of an argument. Recognizing a logical fallacy when you have created one, or even when you see one in the argumentation of another presenter or writer, creates a twofold benefit. You can avoid falling for them if that other writer is trying to convince you of a particular perspective. And you can structure your own arguments in a better, more logical way, because you will have avoided these logical fallacies. Now, a lot of these are going to be relatively familiar to you. You've probably already encountered a majority of them in high school, or you've been told about them if you've ever taken any kind of speech class. They're really big, and speech class is about making sure that you understand logical fallacies when designing an argument. So here we have an example of begging the question, right? The soul is immortal since it lives forever. Since it does not die, thus it is immortal. The error here assumes that a statement is self-evident when realistically it requires proof. A lot of times you'll see moral religious arguments based on premises that beg the question. Because if you don't accept a major premise, if you're an atheist, for example, the argument falls apart right away. Ad hominem, unfortunately, we see this fairly persistently in American politics, which is to attack a person rather than address an issue. This is where you attack the motives or character of the person delivering the counter argument that's under debate, when realistically that has nothing to do with what the logic of the argument should say or should suggest. Circular reasoning really is well represented by this illustration. And as you can see here, it says, the law should be obeyed because it's the law. So no argument has actually taken place here. That supports a statement by just restating it in a different way. The straw man is another very common example in politics. If the real issue is raising the minimum wage, someone would set up a straw man or a more readily available target to our weaker issue to distract from the main point. So if you oppose the minimum wage, you must be heartless. Obviously, you don't care if children starve. Well, that distorts the opposition's opinions. Are we talking about raising a minimum wage, or are we talking about starving children? One thing does not necessarily relate to the other. Now, there is some follow through here, right? If there's not a livable or reasonable minimum wage, it would be difficult for the average person to feed and support a family. Maybe. However, do most people who work at minimum wage jobs have families? I don't know the answer to that. The answer may be yes, but the answer may also be no. But the point is that this opposition to the idea of raising the minimum wage creates a one-dimensional issue, which suggests that if you can't feed your family on a minimum wage, in a minimum wage job, you're being cruel if you don't raise the minimum wage. Well, again, it's not necessarily against anybody's rights to take multiple jobs, or it's not against anybody's right to leave a minimum wage job and get a better job, or seek education to get a better paying job. So you quickly see that although the issue seems to be your personal perspective and whether or not you're cruel, if you would say, I don't want to support the raising of a minimum wage, there's more to be argued than your moral stance. Hasty generalizations are another form of illogical fallacy. With a hasty generalization, you don't reach a conclusion by supplying ample evidence. It also illustrates a sense of sloppy thinking and strong favoritism or bias. Now, you might think that I put this picture of Nixon up here to represent hasty generalizations. And Richard Nixon may very well have made hasty generalizations in his life. But actually, I'm putting it up here because of a unique example featured in your text. Film critic Pauline Kael is a very liberal writer. Upon hearing that Nixon had been elected, was noted to have exclaimed, "How did that happen? Nobody that I knew voted for Nixon." But clearly, Pauline was guilty, as a lot of us are, myself included, of a hasty generalization. We make an off-the-cuff comment because we generalize the world based, or an event that occurs in the world based on our limited range of influence. So yeah, a lot of Pauline Kael's friends didn't vote for Nixon, but obviously the guy won the popular vote. So somebody, maybe not any of her friends, but somebody really wanted to elect Nixon. She made a hasty generalization. Weak analogies. These are very easy to create because, as it says here, analogies are often limited, right? An analogy, of course, is simply a comparison between two items. One that's familiar to a lot of people and is applied to explain an unfamiliar idea. But the bigger the difference between the comparable ideas, the weaker the analogy becomes. Therefore, they're often quite limited. The either-or fallacy suggests that there are two options, and two options only. Either you eat your vegetables, like the young lady over here on the left-hand side, or you are punished by being told to go to bed by the adult authority figure. When realistically, there could be a whole host of other additional options. If you ate a portion of your vegetables, you could, have an earlier bedtime, but not as immediate as the one suggested, or any other range of creative thinking or tactics that could be employed there. Red herrings, right? This is an irrelevant side issue that's brought up. This was often brought up in relationship to Hillary Clinton. And it says she wants us to vote for her, but she'll be 69 years old when she becomes president. And I think that's a problem. That's actually a quote from your textbook. So the red herring here is that her age really has very little to do with her ability to hold the office. And if that argument were to hold water, we'd have to address a whole host of previous presidential candidates who were older than she would have been, who did take office. So a red herring, again, presents an irrelevant side issue and is a term that comes to us from hunting. Anytime that someone wanted to distract a fox from the actual hunt of an animal, they might, or a hound rather, who's hunting a fox, they might wave strong smelling red herring, which is a type of fish in front of the animal's nose, throw off its sense of smell, right? Lead it down another path. Slippery slope, right? We've heard this before. It's an argument that one thing, in the case of this little comic here, gun control legislation, will inevitably lead to another, which would be banning of all guns. But as the owl here says, Super Owl here says, or Captain Logic rather, not so fast, Dr. Fallacy. Gun control laws do not mean no guns. And you can't assume that this series of events will happen. This is highly improbable, in fact, and is a classic slippery slope fallacy, to which Dr. Fallacy, of course, is drats. You got me again, but I'll be back with more faulty logic. Now, at this point, I want to pause just to highlight a few of the newer fallacies that our textbook introduces us to. Like I said, I think most of you have probably heard of the vast majority of these and are very familiar with them. So I appreciate your patience up to this point. But the ones that follow here were somewhat new to me, and they may be new to some of you as well. Appeal to a doubtful authority, right? This is a pretty obvious one. When you appeal to an authority, you want to make sure that it's accurate and believable. So I've used the two contrasting examples. Would you appeal to Wikipedia or would you appeal to Aristotle? Someone who's been quoted for centuries, whose logic is fairly timeless. Or, you could always rely on Wikipedia, which is rife with folk knowledge, and therefore may not be the best initial source to turn to. Non sequiturs, or it does not follow, are the types of arguments that really just lack essential knowledge, or rather essential logic. And here's an example, again, from your textbook. Recently, the polar ice caps have thickened, and the temperature of the oceans has stabilized. Obviously, then, we don't need to address more, to do more to address climate change. Well, that's not true. Just because we see an improvement doesn't mean that there's not more to do or that we can't continue to improve, right? That just doesn't follow. That's a non sequitur. The bandwagon, this is the old adage, if everybody else is jumping off of a cliff, would you do the same thing? It suggests that beliefs are true because they're widely held. If you've ever been stopped for speeding on the interstate, as Mr. Fowler has, you know what this whole exchange is all about. Do you know why I stopped you? The policeman asks. And of course, if you're smart, you answer with, well, I don't know why you stopped me. Don't ever make it easy. Nope, I just saw the lights and I know that when you see the lights, you're supposed to pull over. As far as I knew, you were just going to an accident or some other scene. And they say, well, no, I don't pull you over just for no reason or something like that. And they say, you were speeding. And you say, oh, well, I don't even know how fast I was going. I was merely driving to keep pace with the traffic. And of course, they'll ultimately win because they've got the laser gun or radar gun. And they'll say, well, maybe so, but that doesn't mean you weren't speeding. So you may have been the one who pulled over and got the ticket, but you were not necessarily the one, you were not necessarily completely guiltless either. Everybody else was speeding, but so I thought it was okay for me to speed too. Well, that wasn't the case. Okay, equivocation. This is means a key term has a certain meaning in one part of the argument and another different meaning later. So here's an example, classic joke. The sign said fine, parking here. So because it was fine, I parked there. Obviously, the joke is that fine or okay or permission granted does not mean the same thing as fine. You're going to be charged a fee for parking here, or you'll be issued a citation because you've parked illegally. There's another new one introduced in your text called after this and therefore because this. So that's referred to as post hoc ergo propter hoc. That's the Latin translation, which simply means that because two events occur closely together in time, one must, of course, necessarily cause the other to occur. This is best illustrated, I think, by sports-related superstitions. Imagine a pitcher wears the same pair of socks 2 games in a row and wins both games. The illogical or logical fallacy would be that, therefore, these socks are lucky, and if he continues to wear them, he will win consistently. That, of course, is nonsense, but humans are prone to illogical thinking from time to time. And the after this, therefore because of this idea is another example of logical fallacy. And then we have the you also example. This one was new to me. It's got another name. I just wanted to reference that real quickly. And this is on, what page is it? If you already know the page, you don't have to wait for me. But it's the tu quoque. It's on page 154. Okay, so the you also fallacy is based on the person presenting the argument having gone against what they're advocating for. So over here I've got George Burns who says, you should not smoke. It's bad for you. And we have the young fellow or gal, I think it's a fellow over here on the right, who says, wait a minute, you are clearly smoking, yet you're telling me that I shouldn't smoke. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So this is often sometimes referred to as the, I learned it from watching you, which is a reference to a very popular and frequently satirized skit or commercial from the anti-drug era during the Reagan-Bush administration in the 80s and early 90s, in which a father confronts his son for using drugs. And he said, and he gets in his face and he says, I can't believe you would do this. What, who taught you this? Where did you see this? And the kid kind of breaks down and says, I learned it from watching you. And it cuts to a gravelly voiced narrator who says, parents who do drugs have kids who do drugs. And I don't know what that was supposed to prove. I mean, in terms of the commercial, but it is the you also are logical fallacy argument. Like, it's okay to do it if I see you do it. Therefore, you cannot advocate against it, which is, of course, counter balanced by the do as I say, not as I do argument. Either way, you've got some potential for neither of those arguments holding a lot of water, so to speak, for the person for whom the argument has been made. Okay, and lastly, one of the trickiest versions, and I'll admit that I'm not an expert on this one, and I've even been prone to falling for this illogical use of statistics before. So the misuse of statistics is essentially a matter of interpreting what the presenter wants the statistics to suggest as opposed to what they actually suggest. So if you look at the actual statistics compiled here in your textbook, according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or the NHTSA, 16,653 alcohol-related deaths occurred in the U.S. That's a lot. 12,892 of those deaths involved at least one driver or passenger who was illegally drunk. Also, of those deaths, 7,326 were drivers. Another 1,594 were drunk pedestrians. And then the remainder of the number there of people affected were non-intoxicated. So that's what the statistics actually suggest. But if you misuse those statistics, you could generate suggest like in the course of a single year, there were 16,653 alcohol-related deaths in the U.S. But the number is very misleading. So you have, of course, people who are not intoxicated who were killed in those alcohol-related deaths. There were almost 1,594 of people who were drunk pedestrians who weren't behind the wheel of a vehicle at all. And they were just killed while, crossing the street or doing something they weren't supposed to be doing in traffic. Of the drivers who were were impaired by alcohol, they only accounted for 7,326 deaths. That's less than half, or just about half of the overall statistic that's used in the misused example. 12,000, a great majority of the deaths, involved at least a passenger who was legally drunk. So if they died, maybe the driver wasn't drunk, but it was only the passenger and they distracted the driver or grabbed them or something like that. We don't know, but the misused statistics makes it sound like there were 6,000, almost 17,000 deaths that occurred due to alcohol-related car crashes. So again, you can see how it's easy to use statistics to misrepresent what the actual evidence is telling us. So you have to be careful and conscientious about how you use statistical data when you include it as a piece of evidence. Okay, that brings us to the end of our PowerPoint presentation for today. For next time, of course, you should finish reading Chapter 5 of The Princess Bride for next week. And then when we meet in the future of this week for our second session, we will preview the next writing assignment or next writing project for class. So I'm going to stop share here and return to restore the video. And I'm going to suggest that you use the remainder of our meeting time. I think that, yeah, just about 30, almost 40 minutes here. So you use the remainder of your time for today's session this week to complete the weekly discussion questions. And again, the weekly discussion questions are based around William Goldman and whether or not there is an intentional desire on his point to bring in elements from his life, relationships with his father, his son, his wife, and how they relate to the writing of the book, The Princess Bride, and the process by which he explores the characters and the narrative in that text as relating to his real life. What's the connection, if any? And why do you think he's trying to do that? I'm going to look forward to your responses. I think we'll get some good material out of this one. Okay, that's all for Mr. Fowler for today. Thanks so much for your time and your attention. And of course, keep reading. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Take care, everyone.